What is going on, everybody? We're going to be covering the classical variation in this volume, and I'm going to be mentioning a lot of the other variations. So when I'm covering a position and I just mention that, oh, this is the Potter variation, I won't be explaining it any farther in this volume to save on time and length of the video, but in future volumes, just look up that variety or variation that I mentioned for a fuller explanation down that line. With that being said, classical variation starts off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d, knight takes d4, and bishop will come out to c5. It is worth mentioning before that they have an opportunity to capture your knight before they develop their bishop. If they do that, it is safe to capture the knight with your queen, and now they won't be able to kick it out with the normal move, developing their knight. If they want to weaken their pawn structure, it is possible for them to kick your queen, but they've created a bunch of holes that you should be able to take advantage of and win positionally in the future if they choose to do that. Their strongest move, and really their only move that keeps them in the game from here, is if they develop their queen to f6. And I've said it before, whenever you're in a position where queens are attacking each other, it is a mistake to take. That's one of the most famous lines I've heard and I've repeated. To take is a mistake. You want to back up your queen. If you did something like capture theirs, that gives up your piece that's developed, and that gives them a tempo because they recapture with a developing move. That's why, even if it's two pawns, if there's a recapture, to take is a mistake because you lose your piece, which has a position, and you give your opponent that position when they recapture. So my best move offering suggestion is queen to c3 because they have proven that they like exchanging off material because they did so with the knights. And your queen on c3, if they take, you can recapture with a natural developing move, knight capture on c3. Backing up a couple moves to the beginning of the classical variation, when the bishop comes out to c5, there's three options for the knight: run, attack, or back up. The only other move that the bishop can take is bishop b4 check, and that's the Malaniuk Variation, which we will be covering in a future volume. The only square, other than returning to its starting, natural development square, is moving to b3, attacking the bishop. This is called the Potter Variation, and we will be mentioning this in a future volume. So the two other options left, we will cover now. There's only one piece to attack, and that's the knight. If you capture the knight, black has three options. One being bringing the queen to f6, threatening checkmate on f2. It doesn't have to capture the knight right away because of the, more powerful threat. After white parries that threat, it can pick up the knight after. This is called the Intermezzo Variation, and we will also be covering this in a future volume. So the two recapturing moves we're going to cover here are when black chooses to recapture with the D pawn or B pawn. From here, you want to go ahead and capture their queen and force them to recapture, losing castling rights. And you have several moves which score okay, which are about the same. More or less, all these moves will take place unless if black hinders them in the next coming moves. The first being bringing the knight to c3, so you're defending your e4 pawn. You can bring the bishop to c4, attacking the unprotected f7 pawn. Or you can bring the bishop to f4, attacking the c7 pawn, which is only being guarded by the king currently. Their moves upcoming are going to be knight to f6, and you can go ahead and back up your e pawn by pushing f3 because you're going to be wanting to castle queenside. So more or less, after those developing moves, you should have a decent game. Your pawn structure is better. They have a doubled pawn. You still have one center pawn, and your king will be able to protect itself through castling. But typically, black will capture the knight with the B pawn, knowing if they capture with the D pawn, they're going to give up castling rights. Play usually continues from here, putting your bishop on D3, protecting your E4 pawn. If you put it out any further, it's just going to get kicked around by black's pawns. Black will usually put their queen on H4, looking to apply pressure on white's castled king. White can either castle now or bring the queen right out to F3 straight away. Regardless, they usually bring in another piece, the knight, and when that happens, you want to push H3 to prevent the knight from jumping in on G4 to put a third attacker on the F2 pawn. Once H3 is pushed, black usually pushes D6, opening up the bishop for an attack also on the king side. Queen will then come out to F3, and play can diverse 100,000 billion trillion ways from here. But this should at least get you in a position where you're not losing on the first 10 moves. We're going to back up now and talk about what happens if you back up your knight. You have two pieces that can defend the knight. You have the bishop and the pawn. If you bring the bishop to E3 and they make the mistake of developing their knight next, thinking they can hit that weak E4 pawn, that is the big blunder, and you basically won the game because you're free to capture the knight on C6 now. You're attacking their queen. The queen can't run, so they have to recapture. They got two pawns to do it with. If they capture it with the B pawn, you can go ahead and pick up the bishop for free now, and you are up a minor piece. If that tilt continues and they capture the E4 pawn, I'll show you how to take advantage of this as well real quick. You put your queen on E2 because now that knight is pinned and they have no piece to unpin it with. They can't bring their queen out to protect it because the bishop covers that square. And if they move the king, you can go ahead and pick it up right away. From there, their best try is backing up the knight with a pawn, pushing F5 so you can't capture it with the queen. But then you could just push F3, hitting the knight as well with a pawn. And they may get real aggro and try to throw everything at you. If they attack your queen with the bishop, just move your queen up once. And if they capture your bishop, just recapture. The only other thing I can see them doing is bringing the queen out to H4, checking your king. You can just push G3 at this point in time, and now they got to back up. And it just, a small chance that they choose F6, hitting your, B pawn. Go ahead and capture the knight, because if they do capture that pawn, it's checkmate in 4. Take pawn on E to F, check. If they go D8, it's queen E7 checkmate. And the only other option is F7. I mean, they have the option to kamikaze their queen, but that just delays it one move. So if they go king F7, you go queen E7, and after king G8, you got queen F8 checkmate. That'd be that. And if they capture your knight with the D pawn, you want to go ahead and trade off queens. And after they recapture, now you're good to capture their bishop, and you are up a pawn and a minor piece. Or just a minor piece, I'm sorry. And same thing. If they capture your pawn in this situation, it's best just to bring back your bishop, I would say. Yeah, just bring it back to E3, and you'll have a phenomenal game from here. And that's that. That's if they mess up. So their normal developing move is bringing the queen to F6, adding another attacker on your knight. And that's when you can go ahead and push C3 to defend it a third time. Before we move on, I must name off a couple of the variations we will be covering in future volumes. Instead of pushing C3, the knight can come to b5, threatening to go to c7. This is called the Blumenfeld attack. We will have a future volume on that. After c3 is pushed, black can move their queen over to g6. This is called the Malaniuk Variation. We're going to have a volume on that. And the main line will continue, knight to e7. And the main line is bringing the bishop out to c4. But if the knight jumps to c2, this is also a new variation that we're going to be covering in the future called the Meitner variation. The order that you protect your knight is important. You cannot back it up with the pawn first because they're going to switch it up on you then. They're going to bring their knight out to f6, attacking your e4 pawn. You only have 4 ways to defend that pawn. If you bring out the bishop or the knight, that blocks your queen from defending the knight. And now they can go ahead and capture, and when you recapture, they won a pawn. The only other way to defend it is, 1, pushing up your f-pawn, which totally destroys your protection on your king if you plan on castling kingside, which your queenside's already messed up for castling, and their dark-squared bishop is already gunning down that dark diagonal that your king's going to fall into. And the only other move that protects it is an awkward-looking move, queen to d3, because that protects both now. But that's kind of funky. They could potentially, there's tactics to be had on you. The computer puts this at -2 already. I'm not saying they're going to, but they could put their knight, jump it sooner or later to e5 in the main line. That is one of the next moves coming up. And that's where we're going from here. Continuing down the main line, black's next move is developing their kingside knight to e7. And your main move is bishop to c4. I will mention there is a variation that we'll be covering called the Poulsen attack. That's developing your bishop to b5. There's 2 main variations from here. The runner-up is simply castle by black and castle by white. That's all we're going to touch up on that subject. And the main line, which is knight to e5, hitting the bishop on c4. And the main move is bringing the bishop back to e2, getting it out of dodge, as they say. I will mention that Hanging Pawns is one of the guys I'm subscribed to. He's got a video on a couple Scotch lines. He mentioned that there was another variation that you could try playing as black from here. I believe it was b6, and then white would castle. Black would place the fianchettoed bishop on b7, and then white pushes f4, and then black castles queenside. So look up Hanging Pawns and look up Scotch, and he's got several videos on the Scotch. Basic main lines like the Steinz, the Schmidt, classical, and basically and a couple other mainstream variations, but he doesn't go into like novelties or gambits or anything as far as I know. Anywho, rewinding back to the main line, after bishop c4, knight e5, bishop e2, black's main move is queen to g6, hitting the g2 pawn that's weak, and black is going to castle at this point in time. Even though the e4 pawn is hanging, it's very dangerous for black to capture it because of the move knight to d2. And the only safe square for the queen from this position is traveling back to g6. But he's already in trouble. If he tries doing any other move, he's potentially losing a minor piece or his queen. We're going to be wrapping things up over here. So, more or less, black's next best move is obviously not capturing the poison pawn. It's going to be pushing d6, opening up the light squared bishop. And that's when you want to you do want to push f3, protecting that pawn now. And after black's next move of castle, you want to bring your king and put it in the corner, because if you don't, let's say you did something like this, you do have the move bishop h3 to worry about, since the queen is on the g file. So we're gonna end off with you know with that move, king to the corner. I think that's a good spot to stop. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the classical variation. There's a lot crammed in this episode, a lot of, sidelines mentioned. I do want to appreciate you. We're probably going to be covering like the Steins and the Schmidt next. I'll see you on the next.